Tom stepped through the front door of his quiet country home late Wednesday morning. He hadn't been there since Sunday and had only come back to collect a few things before leaving again. He didn't expect to see his wife, Peggy. She should have been at work. The house was eerily still, filled with remnants of his last visit. In the kitchen, Tom noticed the handcuffs and strip of duct tape lying exactly where he had left them on the table. The kitchen towel was still crumpled on the floor, discarded after he'd wiped his face. The video camera stood on its tripod beside the kitchen table, untouched, and the broken chair lay toppled where it had fallen. He bypassed the coffee maker and instead opened the refrigerator, pulling out a bottle of Diet Coke. "Where the hell have you been?" Peggy's sharp voice broke the silence as she entered the kitchen. Tom didn't answer. He didn't even look at her. He brushed past her and headed toward the bedroom, intent on gathering his clothes. "I asked you a question," she snapped, grabbing his arm. Tom stopped and turned, his gaze locking onto her face. This was the woman he had loved and married 7 years ago, the woman who had been his anchor, and now the woman who had shattered his world. "Let me go," he said softly, his tone devoid of emotion. Peggy hesitated, her grip loosening as she searched his face. His eyes, once bright with life, were now dull and distant. She let him go, watching as he walked into the bedroom. Alone in the kitchen, Peggy swept the handcuffs, duct tape, and towel into the trash with an air of finality. She dismounted the camera from its tripod, placed it on the table, and folded the tripod neatly. In the bedroom, Tom was methodically packing a large suitcase on the bed. "What are you doing?" she asked, leaning against the doorway. "I'm packing," he replied without looking up. "For another business trip?" she asked, her voice laced with sarcasm. "No." "Then where are you going?" He stopped, straightening to face her. His expression remained blank, unreadable. "What does it matter?" Peggy's tone turned accusatory. "You're my husband. I have a right to know." "Peg," he said, his voice steady but hollow, "you gave up that right last Sunday afternoon." He resumed packing, adding the last of his things before zipping the suitcase shut. He carried it into the living room, placing it by the door, and returned to the study. Peggy followed closely, frustration etched across her face. In the study, Tom collected papers from his desk, slipping them into his briefcase. He unplugged his laptop and packed it carefully into its bag with the power cord. Then, as if performing a final act, he returned to the kitchen. The video camera still sat on the table. He picked it up, checking the SD card inside. "Is this what you recorded on Sunday?" he asked, his voice flat. Peggy smirked. "A souvenir of your payback," she said with mocking sweetness. "That's very thoughtful." "Thank you." Tom's face twitched, a flicker of pain breaking through his composure. "Tom, damn it, talk to me," Peggy shouted, frustration turning to desperation. He turned to her, his face now etched with anguish. "What have you done to me?" he asked softly, his voice trembling. "Why are you leaving?" she pressed, her anger replaced by a note of fear. Tom gestured to the table. "Sit," he said. Peggy hesitated but complied. Tom opened his laptop, placed it in front of them, and inserted the SD card. He took a seat beside her. "Let's watch this together. Then we'll talk," he said. The video played, showing the kitchen table on one side of the frame and a chair pushed back on the other. The audio crackled as Peggy's voice came through, sweet and inviting. "Welcome home, baby. Come into the kitchen. I have a surprise for you." The camera showed Tom entering, a smile lighting up his face. Peggy appeared next, wearing a short, thin robe that clung to her figure. Her hair was styled, her makeup flawless, and her bare feet moved lightly across the floor. In her hand, she held a pair of handcuffs, which she dangled teasingly. "Sit down," she instructed, her voice dripping with mischief. Tom obeyed, his smile widening. Peggy walked behind him, crouched down, and secured one of his wrists with a cuff. She looped the chain around the back of the chair, then fastened his other wrist. As she worked, her robe fell open, revealing everything beneath. Tom's grin deepened. Peggy stepped out of the frame momentarily and returned with a strip of duct tape, which she placed over his mouth. His smile was still visible beneath it. Standing in front of him, she let the robe slide from her shoulders to the floor. Tom's eyes widened with delight as he took in the sight before him. "Are you ready for your surprise?" she asked, her voice sultry. Tom nodded eagerly. Peggy's smile widened. "Are we ready here?" she called out. The sound of footsteps echoed through the room. Tom turned his head, his smile fading as another figure stepped into view, a man wearing Tom's robe. "Honey," Peggy said, her tone light, "you remember Joey from my work, don't you?" She walked over to the man, untied the belt of the robe, and let it fall open. Joey stood completely naked beneath it. Peggy tossed the robe onto Tom's lap. The video froze as Tom paused it. He turned to Peggy, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why?" Her smirk faltered. "You know exactly why." Tom sat silently, his expression unreadable, as Peggy's words echoed in the room. "Before we got married, I told you I'd do it," she said flatly, her tone almost dismissive. Tom frowned, confused. Her words seemed nonsensical, detached from reality. "What are you even talking about?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Peggy crossed her arms, meeting his gaze. "Before we got married, I told you that if you ever cheated on me, I would sleep with you again, just to hurt you, and I'd do it right in front of you. You remember that, don't you?" Tom's jaw tightened, his voice firm but tinged with disbelief. "Is that what all this is about? This was your payback?" Peggy raised her chin defiantly. "I promised and I delivered," she said matter-of-factly. "You think I cheated on you?" Tom's voice rose slightly, incredulous. "I know you cheated on me," she snapped, her voice breaking with anger. Tom's lips pressed into a thin line, his patience eroding. "All right, Peggy, let's hear it. When, exactly, did I supposedly cheat on you? And with whom?" "Don't play dumb with me," she spat. "You know exactly when, where, and with whom." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Later, in a sterile office with sleek furniture, Peggy sat opposite her attorney, Ronnie Savage, who regarded her with a calm but piercing gaze. "Let me get this straight," Ronnie began, her tone measured. "You're saying it wasn't adultery because it was a mistake? Is that correct?" Peggy swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she nodded. "Yes, it was a mistake. I was angry. I thought he cheated on me." Ronnie held up a hand, cutting her off gently but firmly. "Adultery isn't defined by intention, Mrs. Given. It's defined by the act. Did your husband consent to this mistake of yours?" Peggy hesitated, guilt and shame flickering across her face. "No," she whispered. "Then it's adultery," Ronnie said bluntly. Her voice wasn't cruel, but it left no room for argument. "I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to help you understand your position. Legally, your husband's case is strong, especially if he has evidence. Do you plan to contest the divorce?" Peggy's eyes filled with tears, her voice cracking as she answered, "I don't want a divorce. I want to save my marriage." Ronnie leaned back in her chair, studying her carefully. "Saving your marriage and contesting a divorce are two very different things. If your husband is determined to end this marriage and has legal grounds, there's little you can do to stop it. My advice: focus on negotiating a fair settlement." Peggy shook her head, her tears spilling over. "I don't care about a settlement. I care about Tom." Ronnie exhaled softly, her expression softening. "Then you need to have an honest conversation with him. But don't expect miracles. From everything you've told me, he's already made up his mind. If you want my help on the legal side, I'll need your full cooperation." That evening, the house felt unbearably quiet. Peggy sat alone, her thoughts swirling with memories of laughter and love, moments that now seemed like fragile relics of a life that was slipping away. The emptiness of the rooms pressed in on her, suffocating and cold. Her hand trembled as she picked up her phone. She dialed Tom's number, her heart pounding, but the call went straight to voicemail. "Tom," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "It's me. Please. I know I hurt you. I know I made a terrible mistake. I was wrong, and I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging you, please give me another chance. I love you. Please, just call me." She ended the call and stared at the phone, willing it to ring. But the silence remained unbroken. Across town, Tom sat alone in his apartment, the weight of the past week crushing him. His head rested in his hands as he replayed everything in his mind: the love he had poured into his marriage, the betrayal he had never anticipated, the pain that felt as though it would consume him. He opened his laptop and stared at the video file. With a deep breath, he clicked play, forcing himself to watch it one last time. Each frame reignited the anger, the sorrow, the disbelief. When the video ended, he stared at the blank screen for a long moment before deleting the file. The memories would haunt him, but he didn't need a visual reminder. The woman he had married, the woman he had adored, was gone, replaced by someone he could no longer recognize. The next morning, Tom met with his attorney to finalize the divorce paperwork. His voice was heavy with resignation as he spoke. "She'll fight it," he said quietly. His attorney nodded. "Let her. You have the upper hand, Tom. Stick to the facts. Stay calm. We'll handle the rest." Tom took a deep, steadying breath. "I just want this to be over." Back at her lawyer's office, Peggy wrestled with the harsh reality of her situation. Ronnie had made it clear, if Tom was determined to proceed with a divorce, there was little she could do to stop him. Her best option was to protect her dignity and negotiate a settlement that would allow her to move forward. But Peggy wasn't ready to move forward. Desperate to bridge the widening chasm between them, she composed a long email to Tom, pouring out her heart and detailing her regret. She hit send, clinging to the hope that her words might reach him. But Tom's response never came. Instead, the following week, she received an official notice from his attorney. The divorce proceedings were moving forward.